And as we move into our next pitch deck, we've got Innovative Finance is our Section 8 scene. Now, next up, we're hearing from Water Utilities Australia for about 2 pitches. The fabulous Graham Dooley will be coming to the stage. And in his first pitch, he's talking about setting the scene for innovations for water infrastructure. And in the second part, he'll be talking about water and agriculture infrastructure investments in Australia. So, Graham, welcome to the stage, and we look forward to your pitch.
All right, thank you. Thank you. And I presume there are some slides coming up. Yes. All right, thank you. I think the whole scene is changing very rapidly here, and the sort of the historic norms of investing in water infrastructure, which have been the province of either governments or farmers, that is changing. And I'm in the next few minutes just going to give a little bit of a picture of why and how that's changing. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Lucia. The capital side of infrastructure, of where the capital comes from and how it gets deployed, is quite complicated, notwithstanding that we are a small country. In the urban sector, the urban water utilities, where most of the money is raised in revenue and most of the money is spent in works, each state has its own legislative model, which is a leftover of a constitution that was framed in the late 1890s. And the large metro utilities, Sydney Water, Queensland Urban Utilities, Melbourne Water, those are well capitalised by their state governments or through their local government owners. It's the non-metro ones, so all of those utilities that are outside the major metro that have had trouble in getting capital and then deploying it. And when you say, well, how many of them are there? All across Australia, there are about 300 water utilities. And I define a water utility as a bunch of pipes and pumps and so on that's got some customers at the end. It's a fairly simple definition. And when you add up all the utilities that are owned by local government and all the utilities that are owned by mining companies and farmer co-op groups and so on, as well as a few that are owned by people like us who are investors, there are about 300 of them. One of the things that we can say in Australia is that economic regulation, that is the setting of prices and standards of service, has worked. That's been applied in the metro water utilities for quite some years. That's been applied very successfully in the gas utilities. Electricity is more complicated, but the economic regulation of the poles and wires and the customer side of that has worked well. You don't hear much about the gas utilities because it all works. Gas comes out when you turn on the stovetop or the hot water heater. And notwithstanding the amount of money invested in gas and gas infrastructure is relatively high. Not quite as high as drinking water, but still very high. The irrigation utilities, these are the utilities that were often set up by government after the First World War and the Second World War, and have been passed across to grower ownership. The capital has not kept pace with the depreciation of the assets, and so they're undercapitalised. And you can see that in the horse trading that was done between the Commonwealth and the states over the Murray-Darling issues, there was a fair amount of capital being handed around from the Commonwealth to the states, and quite an amount of that went into fixing up these old irrigation utilities. Particularly now with COVID-19 and the consequences of that, of the states now and the Commonwealth having very large amounts of debt that they weren't expecting, then the state treasuries who are responsible for the capital side of the water infrastructure system largely are looking at harnessing capital from the superannuation funds. And that is a very easy sentence to say, but actually quite hard to do. The trouble with water infrastructure, as far as an investment is concerned from the superannuation funds, is that the regulated rate of return of that investment is has been extremely low in the past. But the super funds are now able to get their minds around investing in very low rate of return assets. On the operating side of water utilities, governance varies widely. Some of them have got boards or that are essentially elected members of local councils, for instance. Some of them are state boards. Some of them are more expert in terms of drawing on people like me who've had long careers in the water utility sector, and some of them are not. They're people who are political appointees, and the quality of the leadership between the large and the small, and between the metro and non-metro, between urban and agricultural, is quite varied. And that's one of the things that the Productivity Commission reported on in 2017, so about how variable this is. One of the things that is very clear is that everything's getting older. Yeah, look at the colour of my hair. I'm getting older, but all of these assets, particularly some of the agricultural water utilities, the assets are quite old because some of them were developed after the Second World War as sort of agricultural development schemes. It's clear that this question of what you apply capital to and how you do it is one in which you need to have debates. And this has been a particularly welcome aspect of the UK tranche of regulation recently, that the economic regulator has encouraged debate about, at the community level, about what needs to be done. Now, it may be that there's a trade-off between fixing all the overflowing sewers, for instance, and putting up the prices of the sewerage service in the major metro areas. This is a debate that occurred in the UK, and in a number of communities, the answer came back quite clearly. We don't want the prices to go up, and we are prepared to tolerate the odd overflow every now and then. So that debate is best done under the umbrella of a regulatory overseer rather than, I think, in a highly charged political debate where issues just get bandied around. But the best thing, there are two forces at work in the water utility sector now. One is doing better, doing better with water, doing better with recycling, getting greater asset efficiency. And the other thing is doing what I call not worse. In other words, you don't want to go backwards, which means the older assets you have got to work better. And the dollars that you have to spend on new assets or to spend on operation need to go further. I'm delighted to observe that the technology available in the water and sewage systems, the sort of assets that we have, the emergence of high-grade plastic pipes for all of our pipe networks, the better performing treatment equipment, better performing pumps, modern instrumentation and technology has allowed a tremendous advance in automated control of things. And I'm a big fan of the Internet of Things being applicable to just about every moving part in the water infrastructure. In terms of what do I think is needed, I am going to bang on a bit in presentations like this about better governance. I think it's improbable that you have large banks that don't have bankers who sit on their board, or retired bankers who sit in, and it's improbable that you have mining companies that don't have miners who sit on their board. I would like to see the boards of our water utilities, whether they're owned by state government or local government or investors like us, have more expert, skilled people who are come to the end of their executive careers and can make a real contribution to the governance of these businesses. Many of our 300 water utilities are just too small. They're just too small to have the sort of expertise to deal with the issues, and they're too small in terms of their revenue base. And so I think in New South Wales, there are about 90 utilities outside of Sydney and Hunter. And of those 90, you can sort of draw the map and say that could usefully be 5 or 6 or 7 across the whole of the state. And there have been a number of reports going back for the last 15 years, that some of which I've been involved in, that suggest that these be aggregated, and I'm a big fan of that. I clearly like to see skills in organisations. The idea of a local council promoting a guy who used to cut the grass to now run the sewage plant, that just seems to me to be an improbable thing going forward. And I'd like to see people who have appropriate water industry skills and have completed the various training courses be involved more in the operations, which goes to the question of career paths and career streams. In many local government, in the whole local government in each state, the career stream is through the local government management structure, and local government has a broad portfolio of responsibilities in the community. So it's for those young people who start off in local government, the career stream is not in water and sewerage, it's in all of the issues of local government. And I think those larger councils in New South Wales and elsewhere, in the regional water utilities in Victoria and the larger ones in Queensland, have shown that it is beneficial to have career streams where people do move around, but they get promoted and they transfer their skills from one organisation to another. There is clearly a need for better funding. This idea of waiting for the assets to break and then hold out your hand to state government and get a grant to fix a broken asset just needs to be replaced by something better. The Productivity Commission in their 2017 report had a good trawl through all of this subject matter. I'm not some sort of expert about all of these issues, but I note the Productivity Commission had a number of suggestions about levelling the playing field so that if you're in New South Wales, for instance, if you're a consumer, a householder connected up to a water and sewerage system, then it seems a good idea to think that the people who are in the country ought to pay about the same amount as people in the city. But the people in the cities, the bigger cities, have the economies of scale, which pushes the prices down. And the Productivity Commission suggested some sort of level playing field approach be implemented. And I think with the coronavirus now upsetting a lot of the institutional history of financing of assets and operations, the flow of money in the government sector, now's a good time to think about it. And if we go to my next presentation, it was slightly different. Looking at the finance that is available in the Australian water sector, there's a couple. Private equity is the province of investing in businesses. Now, private equity is called private equity because it's not listed equity. Listed equity is on the stock exchange. But people for hundreds of years have invested in companies themselves, and whether that's through super funds or family offices or just out of their own pocket, there is a very active private equity market in Australia, and that's terrific. Venture capital is for startups, that's clear. Infrastructure capital is the sort of capital that I'm part of now that takes the load off state treasuries. And you'll notice that particularly in New South Wales, but in other states, there's a whole lot of what used to be government infrastructure like toll roads and power stations and power lines and gas pipes and all of those things that are now invested in by superannuation funds in this broad class of infrastructure capital. I think that there is a desire for the utilities themselves to be more innovative in the way they use private capital. And there was an attempt, which I was part of, in the 1990s to use the PPP, the public-private partnership or build, own, operate contract, as the investment model. That model, in my mind, is now broken. For most of the sort of public sector, traditional public sector works like water, the PPP model ends up with too high a cost of capital. And you know that when governments can source capital at very low interest rates, the investment rate of return that the economic regulators set in Australia for Sydney Water and Hunter and Queensland Urban Utilities and those that are subject to economic regulation is generally around about 4% post-tax real. Now, if you're prepared to invest in that large amounts of money at 4% post-tax real, then there is a happy home for that investment capital in a water utility. You can't do it now. You can't go and buy shares in Sydney Water. You can't subscribe as you used to be able to do for most of the 20th century. You could subscribe capital to Sydney Water and the other water utilities in the form of debentures, but you can't do that now. So what actually do we need in the water sector? In my area of focus in infrastructure capital, I think it's pretty true to say that most large urban areas of Australia, subject to urban growth and climate change, have run out of water. And so large-scale desalination of the ocean or estuary water or large-scale recycling is on the agenda. There's no doubt about it. In Sydney Water, I quote the case, Sydney Water has a capital program of $8.8 billion, that's $800 million per annum for the next 5 years. And that excludes the desal plant and large-scale recycling. So the amount of capital that a utility like that is consuming is enormous. Now, the question for the state of New South Wales is, should the state invest in that, or should it invest in public hospitals and schools and law and order and improve public transport and all these other things? And the states now are at a point where the amount of capital that they want to invest exceeds the amount of capital that is available to invest from their own sources. So how much are they going to fund? And my thesis is, and it's been successful to date, albeit on a small scale, is that the superannuation funds of Australia, who have about $3 trillion of capital and are taking in hundreds of millions of dollars a month of new capital from our superannuation payments, they're the ones that need to be harnessed. And it's not quite so easy to do unless there is political will at the elected level and chief officer will at the head of agency level. That's the head of Treasury and the head of the major water utilities and head of the regulatory departments to open it up. In South Australia, there's an interesting piece of legislation called the Water Industry Act, under which we own 2 utilities in South Australia. And this regulates how water utilities are controlled and managed. And that has been most interesting to observe, because the single piece of legislation controls all water utilities, whether they're state government owned, local government owned, investor owned, grower owned. And that is now, I think, the model of the new way of thinking at the legislative level. I'd
Graham,
be
you've got 1
happy
minute
to
left.
finish up on that point and take any questions if they'd like to be directed.
Thank you so much, Graham. And I think it would be really great if you do return to the foyer and sit at the tables. I think you've got some really interesting conversations to contribute to this very important area of where do we go next with financing.